My name is Edward Chow. I have the privilege of moderating this discussion of our distinguished panelists, Anders Aslund, who hopefully will come in to us from Florida, I believe, very shortly. Anders, it's warming up in Washington. You can come back up now. Who is a well-known economist and scholar and commentator on the economy of the former Soviet Union. He is also, most importantly, he is our Foundation's Friends of Ukraine Network's chair on the Economic Task Force. Also with us is Kurt Volker, who we all know was a former American ambassador to NATO, as well as special representative on Ukraine during President Trump's first term. And with us also is Joseph Hughes, who is Distinguished Professor of Engineering at Drexel University, who specializes in studying reconstruction, repatriation of population after a war. And most importantly, I think for this topic, you've been focusing recently on peace engineering. Correct. And we would like very much to hear more about that in the Ukrainian context. I will start by asking our panelists a series of questions to get them going. And then hopefully there will be some exchange as well as questions from the audience. My first question is to Anders. Anders, can you tell us what the current state of the Ukrainian economy is, where the greatest needs are from your point of view, particularly for external assistance? Where are we now and what do we need in the future, assuming that there will be a cessation of fighting in a relatively short period of time?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and sorry not to be with you, and in particular not being as elegant as you are on the panel. With the question, the big point I always make is that the Ukrainian economy is surprisingly normal. In a war, you normally have price controls and rationing. Neither is true in Ukraine. It's amazing how you can go and get everything you want in Kiev or Lviv. When I've been there, you go to a Ukrainian ATM and take out Ukrainian cash with your American credit card. For the last years, the Ukrainian economy has done surprisingly well. That's the overall impression. And the current concerns are somewhat high inflation, currently 13%, and therefore a high interest rate of 15.5%, and a massive shortage of labor, as you can understand, in a war when many have left the country, and in particular when it comes to qualified labor, and this drives up labor incomes. But the positive side for this year and the last 2 years is that the international financial support for the Ukrainian budget has been fully satisfactory, about $42 billion for the budget. This is not the military or humanitarian support. And you can say that the Ukrainian budget consists of two parts, $57 billion of the military expenditures and a bit less, which is civilian expenditure that is largely financed by international support. But what should be done? It's quite ridiculous that $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves are frozen in the West, 2/3 of it at least in Europe. And this should be seized from Russia and given to Ukraine in proper forms. That would help. You can say in broad terms, Ukraine now has got about $100 billion in Western support for the last, each of the last 2 years, and it will get something similar for this year. Europe will to considerable extent cover for what the US is not likely to do this year. But if Ukraine instead got $200 billion this year, then Ukraine could win the war. This is what we really need. And Ukraine now can produce arms for $30 billion. When I met Alexander Kamishin, the former Minister of Strategic Industries in Davos in January, he said, we can produce arms this year, mainly drones, for $30 billion, but we only have financing for $10 billion. This is what should really be done in order to change the war. And this is the most critical thing. But further to the problems, I've already mentioned that inflation and the shortage of labor are problems. But I will put it like this, that there are three big bottlenecks in the Ukrainian economy that one has to catch up with. One is external financing that has been resolved. It was really only problematic in 2022. The second is shipping over the Black Sea, and that was resolved by the Ukrainian armed forces in September 2023. And after that, the Ukrainians have managed to keep Black Sea shipping open. Ukrainian exports are primarily grain and iron ore, steel. All these products need to be shipped overseas in order to be competitive. Now they are, and this is without any agreement with Russia. So that Russia now wants an agreement on Black Sea shipping is primarily for Russian interests, not that Ukraine needs it. And so the shipping functions well. The third problem is electricity. And this is what Russia has focused on, trying to cut out as much as possible of the electricity. Russia has bombed all coal-powered power stations in Ukraine and destroyed them more or less. It has bombed 8 of the main hydropower stations. It has not bombed the nuclear power stations. So clearly Russia thinks that's too dangerous. It can do things so that it looks as if the Ukrainians are mismanaging the power stations, but it's not prepared to straightforwardly bomb the power station, the nuclear power stations. So 60% of Ukraine's electricity now comes from the nuclear power stations. Unfortunately, Ukraine, just before the war started, had opened up so that it could import or export electricity to and from Europe. And that is now giving Ukraine a pretty good electricity supply. So surprisingly, there were no blackouts of electricity in January, very limited in February. But last year, it was worse. So the electricity shortage has cut production. So that production has fallen from 5% growth in 2023 to 4% or 3.5% last year, and it's likely to stop at 3% this year. And it's also a certain exhaustion from the war. So what is going well? Agriculture. The agriculture is doing very well. Arms production, as I've just mentioned. Energy has recovered amazingly, as noticed. And then what I haven't touched upon is the high-tech, mainly software production. And then, of course, metallurgy. The industry that did the best last year, not surprisingly, is construction. Because when you have a lot of destruction, you also need construction. Thank you.
Anders, if you don't mind my asking you to dig a little deeper into the Russian frozen asset issue. I mean, obviously, most of the destruction, all of the destruction, was caused by Russia to begin with. in Ukraine. We were hoping the Biden administration would set example by using the smaller amount of frozen assets that are in American hands, but they didn't do that. The prospect of that it seems less now under this administration. Given that Europe has announced their own needs on rearmament and the call on the budget or European budgets for that, isn't this question of becomes even more urgent now on how to use the frozen Russian assets? What's stopping Europe from doing this on its own, and what can be done to change that?
Excellent question. And the answer is there's nothing really that can stop Europe from doing it, apart from lousy politicians. The countries that have been mainly against it are Germany and France. President Macron made even a statement today, as we speak, saying that it would be wrong to take the Russian assets, as usual, without any argument. This is something that has to be done. And the person who is mainly agitated against it has been the president of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde. And her argument has been that it would undermine the euro. Well, the Russian assets have been frozen for 3 years already. So that argument is blown. The French have been threatened by the Chinese and the Saudis that, according to Financial Times, that if they would do anything to seize these assets, then these countries would not buy their bonds any longer, which is a completely empty threat. There are so few countries whose bond you can buy. And we have not seen any move out of European treasuries because of this. Belgium has a special problem since almost all of the money, or say 2/3 of the money, is in the private Euroclear bank in Belgium. And Euroclear is afraid of getting massive legal claims from Russia. And they want protection from the Belgian state, and they want protection from the European Union, and they don't think that they have got enough of it. But these are a petty thing. We have members of our task force, Robert Zellick and Philip Zelikow, who are very strongly agitated for it, and also Larry Summers, I should mention, and Professor Lawrence Tribe at Harvard have clarified why this is a legally correct thing to do. And Europe really has to wake up and get this done.
Thank you, Anders. Kurt, and I would like to turn to you, and feel free, by the way, to weigh in on this question about the frozen assets. Seems like it's a political level decision at this point that needs to be made by European governments. But also broaden it a bit to the general question of organization and leadership of Western economic assistance to Ukraine. How are we doing, and what could be done better?
Okay, thank you. First off, on the assets, I just saw earlier today that French President Macron made a public statement in which he said, we have no right to seize the frozen Russian assets. So you are quite correct, Ed. It is both at a political level, and there is a lack of political will to do it. And I'm surprised because I would have thought that one of the European reactions to the Trump administration would be, we've got to figure this out ourselves. And we're sitting on a pile of money, so we don't actually have to spend our own money.
Right.
So that's what I would have thought the reaction would be. And it doesn't seem that that has broken through. So,
not yet.
At least not yet. So that's getting a little feedback here. So that's on that. Let me take your debate here and, and talk about the broader effort to support Ukraine's economic recovery and reconstruction. I have attended the Ukraine Recovery Conferences in Lugano in 2022, in London in 23, in Berlin in 24. I've been working a bit with the Italians on 25. Before this, they were called Ukraine Reform Conferences, and I went to several of those also in Copenhagen and in Toronto. And I'll just be very blunt. Nothing has come out of these. Nothing of any significance. There are a few deals announced that might have been deals that happened anyway. There are thousands of people who attend. They get together and talk and meet, and they go away, and they come back again another year, and then they go away. So it has been a real disappointment. At the first one of the recovery conferences, the one in Lugano, Liz Truss was then the UK Foreign Secretary. And she put on the table then a proposal for Western governments, G7 governments, to come up with a scheme for war risk insurance, something that has been talked about for 3 years now. And there are a couple of mechanisms that do exist, but they are not well understood. They are not well funded. There has been no effort to, on a systematic basis, disaggregate risk in Ukraine so that you can have like a stoplight system of green, yellow, red that potential investors or businesses could go to financiers and say, this is a green investment, this is a yellow investment, and go to insurance companies and get different rates based on this. None of this is happening. So I think that we are facing the likelihood of a ceasefire of some kind this year. I am skeptical that there will be a full peace agreement. I don't think Putin will ever relent on his maximalist demands, but we might end up with an end to fighting that then needs to be policed. And that is the time to really lean in on economic reconstruction and recovery. So I would propose, and I have written about this, I'm going to write more about it. I've talked to my Italian friends about it. I need to get over to the White House at some point. But we should be developing a concept, or we should be implementing a concept, I should say, of a permanent executive body in charge of Ukraine's economic recovery. It needs to be at a high political level. I would recommend a former prime minister of a European country should lead this. There should be some senior board members. Anders mentioned Bob Zellick in his comments, and Bob would be an ideal board member for something like this. And a small staff that keeps working day to day, every day, and would not try to duplicate the functions of national governments, of international financial institutions, of private investors and so forth, but would provide focus and leadership, which is what's lacking right now. And what would that focus and leadership do? It would identify problems that are inhibiting investment and economic recovery and try to start tackling them, figure out who can tackle this, go knock on their door, talk to them about it. They would be a vehicle for input from the private sector. The private sector has formed an advisory council with nobody to advise. And so they would be a vehicle for engagement with the private sector. They would be able to coach the Ukrainian government and say, you want to attract investment, here's what you need to do. Your current business climate is not working or is not attracting that investment for a variety of reasons. Some of them are not in your control, like the war, but others are in your control. So here's what you need to do to be successful at attracting investment, and on. But it would be, I think, essential that we stop just getting together once a year and talking, and create something that has follow-up, follow-through, implementation, day-to-day focus.
Well, I'm going to take your bait, since you mentioned these reform conferences before and the recovery conferences since 22. you know better than me that these large get-togethers are most useful if they're action forcing.
Yes.
In other words, the staff work was done weeks, months beforehand. There was political alignment among the parties so that when you get to the conference, and there's another one scheduled in July in Rome, that you make the big announcement.
Exactly.
You would think that this American administration, which desires a ceasefire as soon as possible, would also see it beneficial to be working on this at the same time, because if you have nothing that follows a ceasefire, that just means the firing will start again at some point. Do you see that work either being done here in Washington or European capitals to use Rome as kind of a mobilizing occasion rather than yet another talk fest?
Short answer, no, I don't see it. I don't think they have the people in place who are focused on this. We basically have cabinet level secretaries as action officers right now, as we saw from that signal thread that was leaked. We don't have the depth. I think there is a disposition in the administration that Europe should do these things, which is good. I think Europe should do these things.
Wouldn't disagree with that,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. But we can coax them along. An example is probably the institution that has been created, if you can call it an institution, is the Multi-Donor Coordination Platform. And this was an effort during the Biden administration to create a means of coordinating among the US, the EU, and Ukraine on assistance to Ukraine. It met at a technocratic level, so a Deputy National Security Council, Deputy National Security Advisor for Economics. It was Director General of the EU Commission and I think a cabinet minister from Ukraine. But they would meet maybe once a month, once every 6 weeks. They wouldn't actually make any decisions. They would talk again, but there was no concrete agenda out of this. No single leadership. It was three chairs, triple chaired. No political level attention, and no accomplishments that can be identified. And the Trump administration has come in, and there is due to be one of these meetings in Kyiv. I believe it's in early April, and we don't know if we are attending.
Oh gosh. But you're calling for something much stronger than that. You're calling for
yes.
a permanent executive.
Think of the role that the NATO Secretary General plays when you have the need to cajole countries to increase defense spending, to contribute forces to an operation, to provide the framework, the intellectual, the conceptual framework of what we, NATO, are trying to accomplish. Secretary General plays a big role in building that consensus, and then people carry it out. You need somebody like that.
Okay. Joe, let's take it from Washington and European capitals to on the ground in Ukraine, where it really matters. I mean, obviously, the only way Ukraine is going to recover is if some of the displaced people, or most of the displaced people, are in a position to go home. Mm-hmm. Both internally displaced, but also refugees in many European countries. For that to happen, there are some basic public services that need to be provided, water, energy, schools need to be operating, otherwise the family and kids won't come back from wherever they are now. What's the best way of approaching that, assuming that we have a cessation of fighting at least for a while?
That's an excellent question. And before I join in on this discussion, I want to say happy birthday to Nadia. What a great day. Glad to be here with you today. The history would show that in the reconstruction after war or the reconstruction after large-scale natural disasters, the ability to bring people back, whether that's people who've left a country or left a region and come back home, so to speak, or those who are internally displaced and have a chance to return to their home in their country, is always greatly overestimated in the capability to do this. And we find that in most cases, the level of return is much, much lower than anticipated. And there's a number of factors that we think go into this. And many of them are greatly appreciated, things like what you mentioned, power, water, sanitation, et cetera, that are largely large-scale infrastructure systems that were in place before and have been destroyed, and you say, well, let's just rebuild those. And that's necessary, but absolutely insufficient. And the decision-making that takes place for individuals who have been displaced, whether they've left the country or just internally displaced, are very much at an individual level or a family unit level in their decision to return or not. And these represent really complex decisions that many of us would consider in our day-to-day lives as to whether we would relocate under very different conditions, of course, but still the idea, would we relocate under these conditions? And there's little things that oftentimes you say, well, no, maybe I shouldn't. And it's those little decisions at the individual or family unit level that are almost never appreciated in these post-natural disaster and post-war conditions. And things are built and they don't come. So things are built like power systems, et cetera, but they don't come. And it is at this level of thinking that I think is very, very important, the individual decision making. It's very easy to think about in quote, recovery or reconstruction, to put roads where there used to be roads, bridges where there used to be bridges, repair the power systems to where that they used to be. From an engineer's perspective, and my background is engineering, that's really easy. There's companies that will do that in a heartbeat. There's other issues that are vastly more complicated, some of them technical, some of them not, that need to be addressed and will only occur with significant planning. And Ambassador Volker, I second, I've not been to all those meetings, but I've not seen substantial planning that's taken place to consider these issues. I would list, first of all, security and rule of law. Without that, there is no real hope for advancing beyond that. That's an absolute mandatory component for people to return. If you're not secure, if you're unable to do any type of conflict resolution, that will be an impediment immediately. But if that can be overcome, and I think our next panel talks a lot about security and rule of law in their discussion, so I'll avoid that, we get into a whole range of other issues. And I would offer up one of them is the hazards of war. We know a great deal about in civilian populations, the effects of the hazards of war. In the eastern part of Ukraine, obviously, we have a huge amount of explosive devices, unexploded ordnance, landmines, et cetera. There would be massive impediments for people to return, and it's technically an important challenge. And then in the western parts of Ukraine, there'd be a different set of challenges, but very, very important for just managing public health, health of children, et cetera, et cetera. These types of things manifest into people's decisions or family decisions to relocate. And it takes planning in advance and coordination in advance to overcome these issues and promote as much return as possible, which I think is critical for economic development.
Thank you. Are there opportunities in this recovery period where Ukraine doesn't just build back the old infrastructure, which may not have been well thought out to begin with, given that it was conducted under the Soviet Central Planning System, to leapfrog to something better than what was there before?
Absolutely, and I think not only better, but more resilient. And more resilient in the face of conflict, if there were conflict in the future. So I think this is an important point. Rebuilding the Soviet-era infrastructure should be avoided, full stop. The idea of then upgrading to EU standards would be interesting, but would miss a tremendous opportunity. The idea would be to leapfrog even many of the European Union type standards or what we would see here in the States, and to work in the implementations of systems that are much more efficient, meet more of the sustainability requirements the EU is looking for, things that will be more resilient in the face of conflict. So in particular, we think of distributed systems as opposed to large nuclear power plants, for example, as a singular big iron facility, to be thinking about distributed infrastructure, in particular in agricultural regions where you have great distances for transmission and things. I don't want to get into some of the technical elements, but there's a huge capability in water, power, information, et cetera, that can be done at a distributed level that leapfrogs existing infrastructure by several generations and then puts Ukraine in a position to be very competitive looking forward.
Would you then say that in the area that I have a little bit familiarity with in energy, more wind and solar versus highly centralized systems like nuclear? I mean, is it a mistake to buy Bulgaria's reactor that was never put in place?
You're very modest with regard to your experience in energy systems. I feel like I'm walking into a trap right here. But I think in distributed energy, I think certainly wind and solar are examples of that. But you get into, for example, in agricultural regions, a lot of biogas production capabilities. I'm also very intrigued, and there's limited information on this, but very interested in the potential for Ukraine to participate in a hydrogen economy, which is a true leapfrogging effort in terms of carbon-free energy. Not only did it have potential for what's called green hydrogen, there's different colors of hydrogen, I get them mixed up. Blue hydrogen from their nuclear facilities from just splitting water, but also some of the geological hydrogen that looks like maybe a potential in Ukraine as we get better at finding that. So distributed systems that could also be based in a hydrogen economy would be a real leapfrogging in energy systems that I think would be worth discussing.
Thank you. We started a little late, and I don't know how much more time organizers will allow me, but I know there are questions in the audience, and when you respond to the questions, feel free to add whatever additional thoughts that come from the conversation. Sigis.
Okay, I just want to confront my old friend, I don't know if you want. A lot of criticism to Europe. So I think America, to use the Trump words, is losing all the cards in that game. You know, we as Europeans, we have a plan to have Ukraine member of the European Union. We are starting accession talks. I know what it means. It means fixing every centimeter of your body, killing all Soviet viruses, and maybe having them member in 2030. Together with Kurt, we've been in Bucharest. If you want to have cards, you have to put NATO membership in. Then you can speak about, you know, economic recovery, because even if we do it as Europeans, you know that Russians will come and bomb it. We will do, in any case, whatever we can. You notice recent decisions of European Commission. We are actually getting Ukrainians as member in defense. All those 800 billion, whatever things we create with Andrius Kubilius will be used together with Ukrainians. At the same time, we don't hear it from Americans. We hear that you will not, you know, make big military assistance. And in addition to that, we don't hear that you will actually stop sanctioning Russians and Belarusians, you know, when we step in with our sanctions. So, and in addition to that, you have Russian ambassador coming to Washington, D.C., and he will launch all disinformation attacks. He will bribe and steal in Washington, and we know what Russians do with all the KGB. So instead of helping us and dancing tango with us, you are actually losing. You are just throwing those cards away, and then you dare to say what we have to do in Ukraine with the economy. Have your plan. Tango is tango. Remember Marshall Plan? Remember what you did with us? So either you dance with us or you don't talk like that.
I don't know if that was a question or not, but
But you can just say yes.
Yeah. Well, we have the administration that we have, and we had opportunities to move NATO membership for Ukraine in the last couple of years. Biden administration wouldn't do it. Germany wouldn't do it, hiding behind the Biden administration, and you know, we lost that window. And I think the current administration is genuinely of the view that the U.S. does more than its share when it comes to aid to Ukraine, when it comes to security in Europe, and so on. So they want to rebalance that. I think that this can still come out okay. I think we all have to keep framing it and organizing it and steering it, to say this is where we want it to go. I think it can be done. But it is less clear than it would have been with a different administration.
May I add
Please,
just a comment? One of the things that you mentioned was the Marshall Plan. And I just wanted to clarify some of my comments with regard to planning for the future of Ukraine. And I want to contrast or use the Marshall Plan as an analogy. So the Marshall Plan was drafted and implemented or passed here in the United States in '47, about 2.5 years after VE Day, and wasn't truly implemented till almost 1948, 49, depending on which country you're in Europe. And in that time period, the people of Europe suffered dramatically. And there was a very high probability of return to war or regional wars in that time period. And one of the things that I would hate to see in the case of Ukraine is a period of years going by without a, quote, equivalent of Marshall Plan, the other half of the walnut, as Truman called it. That plan could be developed sooner. Would it be perfect? No. Eisenhower taught us that you throw the plans away in battle, but the planning process is critical. And I think there's some opportunity lost there, and I think that's what I may have sensed from Ambassador Volker, that we can be doing both, I think both are important. And so the Marshall Plan is a wonderful track record, but there was a period of time where the civilians of Europe suffered significantly, and we shouldn't repeat that error.
That's a very pertinent point. Anders, would you like to weigh in on this question since you are the resident European on our panel?
I pretty much agree with Sigis, even if Sigis took a stop to. And of course, we are very happy to have strong bolts now in the European Commission, Kaja Kallas, Valdis Dombrovskis, and Andrius Kubilius.
Okay. Any?
We had a question over here. He's been quite patient.
Oh, go ahead.
So, this microphone really
It's
works.
working.
My question is for Joe Hughes. My question is kind of, I would say, rather technical, and I don't have any serious information about this, but I noticed that wind and solar came up, and as opposed to a large nuclear facility. My question has to do with what I've heard is out there are people talking about micro-nuclear plants. Do these things exist? Are they any good? Are there dangers to them? What do you think?
Answering questions about nuclear power in an audience of strangers is always something I try to avoid. But I'll give it a shot, okay, just for the sake of it, because there's certainly different opinions on nuclear that people bring with them to in any audience. But there have been significant advances for several decades now in reducing the size of nuclear facilities and also standardizing those facilities so they're much more rapidly implementable and also serviceable. And so there are real opportunities here, and we're seeing a large push, I think, here in the States and in the EU. You can correct me if I'm wrong with the EU. To develop these facilities much more rapidly now to drive the power requirements of data centers. We actually be putting power facilities adjacent to or on the same property lines with the power consumers. And the scale of those would be similar to large communities, small city type power requirements, maybe a little bit more like moderate sized cities. So yes, there's been tremendous advances of those. There's different approaches that have been identified. Some are going to commercialization, but that is the idea of a more distributed network of power generating systems than one very large facility, which has sort of characterized the nuclear landscape to date. Is that fair?
Absolutely fair. I mean, what you're referring to are what are called small modular reactors, or SMRs. And the concept is great. It seems very promising, but I would say yet unproven. in terms of its commerciality, partly because of scale. You have to build a lot of these plants in order to have the manufacturing capacity and prove the economy of scale works. But yes, it would be much more promising in the case a place like Ukraine that already have the electricity grid system to connect smaller power generators rather than building large, classic nuclear facilities.
Agreed, and I do think that in this regard, the ability for Ukraine to be a place to prove these kinds of technologies would advance them, because currently we're looking for places to actually test them and develop a fleet, and it's very hard for entry. So,
Bob, but I think you may get the last question given time.
Okay, and thank you, Ed. I think this is directed to Anders, and I'm not sure we have definitive answers, but one of the questions that this panel or this task force has talked about is, as an impediment for people moving back, is that if you've had people working in the United States or Western Europe and building up retirement plans and so forth, there have been, as I recall, we had a discussion, Anders, that there are ways to figure out how you can transfer those back so that they don't lose what they've gained financially in the West. Do you have some comments on that? Is that something that we should be looking at, and there are ways to address it?
Yes, we should. And I can say that in Europe, they have now made the pension schemes transferable. So if you work for a few years in one EU country and then move to another EU country, you just add them together and you don't lose your pensions. For example, I have a Swedish pension for the limited period I worked in Sweden, and I have a US Social Security for the time I worked in the US. So the point is, in the US, you have to be for 10 years in order to go get the Social Security, and you need to stay in the country. In Europe, those rules don't apply. So the general answer is yes, pensions should be transferable, they should be secured, and they should be correctly calculated so that people get the pension for the time that they've worked. Europe has done a lot, but not sufficient on that, and that should apply also to Ukrainians.
Well, thank you very much, panelists, for this wonderful discussion, and please join me. Appreciate it.